Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents China as a 21st-Century Naval Power, Theory, Practice, and Implications, by Michael McDevitt. Narrated by Ian Putnam. Publisher's Note. In this audio edition, you will hear references to tables and maps present in the print and ebook formats of the book. Preface. This is a book about today's Chinese Navy and how it transitioned from the baby operational steps it was taking in the 1990s to the legitimate blue water force it is today. It argues that 10 years of Northern Arabian anti-piracy patrols, thousands of miles from China, represented the key accelerant in this rise in capability. These operations were a blue water laboratory where the Chinese Navy learned how to sustain warships on distant station for many weeks at a time. They overlapped with the takeoff in Chinese naval warship procurement that began just 15 years ago. Since 2005, the People's Republic of China, PRC, has financed the building of enough warships to create the second most capable blue water navy in the world. Burdened with the awkward official name of People's Liberation Army Navy, the PLA Navy, in some sources simply PLAN, is the naval arm of the Chinese Communist Party, CCP. Although it flies the national flag, its loyalty is to the CCP, and the leaders of the PRC never let its members forget this. This party navy is a modern, well-equipped force that is numerically larger than the U.S. Navy. Yes, the PLA Navy is the largest navy in the world. This is still a bit of shock. In fact, one respected scholar argued in 2018 that China will never become a sea power as long as it remains a vast land empire. The sea is so unimportant to China that China does not have a navy. Technically, I suppose he is right, but if China does not have a navy, the CCP certainly does. In fact, the sea is so important to the PRC that it has its sights set on becoming a great maritime power, with a navy that is world-class, in the words of Xi Jinping, the General Secretary of the CCP and also President of the People's Republic of China, and Commander-in-Chief of China's military, the PLA. This book is not a history of the PLA Navy. That book has already been well written, twice, by Dr. Bernard Cole. What it attempts to do is explain how the PLA Navy arrived, seemingly overnight, in its role of eminence, where it is headed in terms of growth, and what role it plays in defending China and Chinese national interests. It delves in some detail into the role the PLA Navy plays in the Chinese military's layered defense concept. That concept the U.S. Department of Defense, DoD, characterizes as anti-access and area denial, or, as it is better known by defense experts worldwide, A2AD. It explains how the PLA Navy fits into a joint Chinese military concept of operations aimed at keeping America's Navy and Air Force at arm's length should conflict between the United States and China break out. The role the PLA Navy might play in denying U.S. armed forces access to the Western Pacific Ocean, where America's regional allies, Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, and Thailand, all live in the shadow of China, is explored in this book. Taiwan, also known as the Republic of China, ROC, is also in the PRC's shadow. Taiwan is an important topic in this book because it is the East Asian friction point that could most credibly involve the United States in a war with China. Should the PRC elect to use force to reunite what it deems its wayward province, the PLA Navy will play a leading role. In the unlikely but possible event that Xi Jinping orders the PLA to attack, U.S. forces permanently stationed in East Asia could quickly become involved in conflict with China. That is especially true for the U.S. 7th Fleet and 5th Air Force, both of which are stationed on Japanese territory. The book explores the operational roles of the PLA Navy and its sister PLA services in such a conflict. This work also aims to put the PLA Navy into the broader context of China's national goal to become a great maritime power, or, as some would have it, a maritime great power. The PRC has developed an impressive blend of all the capabilities one would associate with maritime power. Discovering these facts is the reason I decided to write this book. I was reviewing, in connection with a research project, the text of former PRC leader Hu Jintao's 2012 tediously long work report to the Party Congress at the end of his term in office. Wading through an English version of the document, I came across a statement establishing as a national objective that China should become a great maritime power. I was immediately struck by the audacity of such an assertion, as well as with its candor and lack of equivocation. My curiosity was piqued. How did the leadership of the Chinese party state think about maritime power? How did it interpret maritime power? Why did it want to become a maritime power? These questions eventually led to an 18-month study, which in turn eventually led to this book. It became clear over the course of my research that the Chinese Communist Party leadership has concluded that becoming a maritime power is essential to long-term national goals, goals that the current General Secretary has encapsulated as the China Dream, a so-called great rejuvenation of the Chinese state that will be accomplished by 2049. The more my colleagues at the Center for Naval Analyses, or CNA, a research center in Arlington, Virginia, just across the Potomac River from Washington, D.C., and I dug into the maritime power goal, the clearer it became that when Hu announced this objective in 2012, China was not starting with a clean sheet of paper. This was not a bolt-out-of-the-blue aspiration. Rather, in terms of party policy, it was the culminating point of over a decade of careful consideration of, and appreciation for, the importance of the maritime domain to China's continued development, to its security, and to its vision of its place in the world. China's strategic circumstances have changed dramatically over the past 30 years. Since the 1990s, the dramatic growth in China's economic and security interests abroad have combined with traditional maritime-centered strategic objectives, such as unification with Taiwan and the reclaiming of land features in the East and South China Seas, to create a new reality that demands a focus on the maritime domain. Once Xi made maritime power an element of his dream of the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, it became a foregone conclusion that becoming a great maritime power will remain a national objective. China defines maritime power the way the world largely defines it, as a broad construct that encompasses more than naval power. What is different, however, is the Chinese emphasis on the power that having a world-class navy yields. Such a force is the essential prerequisite of great maritime power. That is why the focus of the book is the PLA Navy. It is the keystone of the entire Chinese maritime power edifice. Beijing clearly understands and appreciates that the maritime power equation also includes a large and effective coast guard, a world-class merchant marine and fishing fleet, a globally recognized shipbuilding capacity, and an ability to harvest or extract economically important maritime resources. This book also dwells on another statement made before a party congress, this one by Xi Jinping. During his first work report as General Secretary to the 19th Party Congress in 2017, Xi stated he wanted the entire PRC military establishment, known as the People's Liberation Army, to be a world-class force by 2049, and that ongoing modernization was to be largely completed by 2035, just 15 years away. Neither Xi nor other senior officials have defined what world-class means, but the phrase connotes second to none, top tier, or best in the world. This work puts flesh on these bones and provides a sense of what world-class means for the PLA Navy. The central role the PLA Navy plays in China's contemporary national strategy is examined. PRC strategists are obsessed with the notion that America is bent on containing China. The PLA Navy's mission includes trying to thwart any attempt at military containment, which would almost certainly capitalize on the PRC's economic dependence on maritime trade in raw materials, especially hydrocarbons. This dependence causes Beijing and the PLA Navy to be anxious that its sea lines of communication, SLOC, could be interrupted. Reading official PLA defense documents could lead one to believe the PLA Navy is suffering from a case of SLOC anxiety. For the PLA Navy, the problem is real. It is particularly acute in the Indian Ocean, where its long SLOC presents the PLA Navy with a very difficult defense problem. A very different SLOC situation exists in the South China Sea, where since the late 1950s the PLA Navy has played a leading part in China's slow but steady accumulation of land features and their conversion into military bases. Today, a network of island bases provides the PLA Navy the means to protect this 1,000-nautical-mile SLOC. In short, this book addresses the surprising growth and maturation of the PLA Navy. It is an exploration of the growth of China's Navy from the perspective of the missions assigned by the party state. It discusses why China seeks to become a maritime power, why President Xi Jinping has determined that China should possess a world-class Navy by mid-century, and why he is pressing the entire PLA, including the Navy, to have this world-class objective largely completed in 15 years. Coincidentally, perhaps, 2035 is also when the Trump administration's goal of a 355-ship U.S. Navy is projected to be achieved. The book concludes by exploring what a world-class Navy might look like. We know it will be big, but will it begin to operate sizable naval task forces abroad on a routine basis as the U.S. Navy does? Or will the operational focus remain regional, with only modestly sized formations active overseas? My conclusion is that it will be a force with global expeditionary capability, mimicking the United States in certain aspects in the Indian Ocean region, but that it will also maintain an overwhelming regional force reminiscent of Imperial Japan's on the eve of World War II. Finally, not so very long ago the idea that China would become a maritime power seemed absurd. Today, that preposterous idea has become reality. On June 1, 2019, DoD released an official Indo-Pacific Strategy Report that repeats a claim first made in the Trump administration's national security strategy, that China seeks Indo-Pacific regional hegemony in the near term and ultimately global preeminence in the long term. This book judges that maritime predominance in the Western Pacific is a credible Chinese aspiration. I am, however, dubious that China seeks global preeminence. However, if the DoD is correct, Beijing is going to need a very large navy. A word about the appendices. This work has two superb contributed appendices, one on the China Coast Guard and the other on China's maritime militia. They were written by America's leading experts on these subjects, Ryan D. Martinson, Dr. Andrew S. Erickson, and Connor M. Kennedy, at my request. I asked them to do this because to focus simply on the PLA Navy would produce an incomplete and unbalanced picture of the totality of China's coercive maritime power. In the East and South China Seas, the PLA Navy has largely remained over the horizon, leaving the dirty work of asserting China's maritime claims, in an often heavy-handed way, to the Coast Guard and the PLA-controlled maritime militia. Chapter 1. China's Maritime Power Ambition. November 17, 2012, was an important moment in China's maritime history. The approximately 2,200 senior party members attending China's 18th Party Congress heard something they had never heard from a leader of the party state. Hu Jintao, the outgoing General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, informed them China should become a maritime great power. This single sentence, that China should enhance our capacity for exploiting marine resources, develop the marine economy, protect the marine ecological environment, resolutely safeguard China's maritime rights and interests, and build China into a maritime great power, was of great significance. For the first time in China's long history, its leader had asserted that China, a traditional continental power, aspired to become a leading, perhaps the leading, maritime power. at the time it would have been easy to disregard this single sentence as just one more in a long list of objectives and aspirations in Hu's end-of-tour wrap-up. It was not. Party Congress work reports are accounts of the preceding 5 years of leadership of the party state and also reflections of party consensus on the policy agenda for the next 5 years. They most certainly are not empty exercises in party jargon and rhetorical ritual. Now, almost a decade after Hu's departing exhortations, Beijing's tangible actions make it quite clear that becoming a maritime great power is a very serious and well-considered strategic objective, one dictated by China's growing dependence on the high seas for defense, trade-driven economic growth, raw materials, food security, fish for protein, and the recovery of lost island territories. In short, the announcement of the objective of becoming a maritime great power was not a bolt out of the blue. Rather, it marked the culminating point of over a decade of careful Chinese consideration of, and appreciation for, the importance of the maritime domain to its continued development, its security, and its vision of its place in the world. For instance, as early as 2007, Hu asserted to a group of PLA Navy officers at a party meeting that China was a great maritime power and that it needed to continue to develop blue water, high seas capabilities. Later in his long presentation, Hu announced another goal directly related to the maritime power objective. He called for building a military that would be commensurate with China's international standing. This statement is a broadly defined benchmark for determining how large and capable the PLA should become. As we will discuss, Hu's successor has elaborated on this rather vague objective and restated it more specifically as achieving a world-class military by 2049. Again, neither Hu's statement or his subsequently established related goals were empty rhetoric. Becoming a great maritime power and building a world-class military have been embraced as objectives and clarified by his successor, the current party general secretary, chair of the Central Military Commission, CMC, and President of the People's Republic of China, PRC, Xi Jinping. During his first work report as General Secretary to the 19th Party Congress in 2017, Xi defined commensurate with China's international standing to mean world-class. We will make it our mission to see that by 2035, the modernization of our national defense and our forces is basically completed, and that by the mid-21st century our people's armed forces have been fully transformed into world-class forces. While building a world-class military is a work in progress, there is no question that the necessary reorganization and modernization of the PLA is well underway. The PLA Navy has been an especially favored beneficiary of the decisions to grow and modernize the PLA. For students of the PLA, the immediate question in the aftermath of Hu's speech was how much his chosen successor, Xi Jinping, had influenced the report and embraced its objectives. This question was answered conclusively in China's 2012 Defense White Paper, DWP, which was not released until April 2013, after Xi Jinping had assumed party and national leadership. China is a major maritime as well as a land country. The seas and oceans provide immense space and abundant resources for China's sustainable development, and thus are of vital importance to the people's well-being and China's future. It is an essential national development strategy to exploit, utilize, and protect the seas and oceans, and build China into a maritime power. It is an important duty for the PLA to resolutely safeguard China's maritime rights and interests. In 2012, it was not entirely clear to observers what the leadership of China meant, since in Western usage, maritime power is ambiguous. Was Beijing using it as a synonym for sea power, a term that in the West normally relates specifically to navies? Or were they using it in its broader sense, one that includes all aspects of the maritime enterprise? What is a maritime power? As Professor Jeffrey Till has written in his well-regarded work Sea Power, maritime power and sea power are often vaguely defined. Ever since sea power entered the global security lexicon, thanks to Admiral Alfred Thayer Mahan, its precise definition and that of maritime power have been unclear, which results in their often being used interchangeably. In current Western discourse, maritime power tends to be used as an inherently broad concept, embracing all uses of the sea, both civil and military. In its widest sense, it can be defined as ability to use the sea to exert military, political, or economic power or influence. The maritime power of a state reflects sea-based military capabilities, such as ships and submarines, as well as a range of military land-based assets and space-based systems that may or may not be operated by the Navy. It also includes civilian capabilities, such as a coast guard, port infrastructure, merchant shipping, fishing, and shipbuilding. A good example of a broad definition of maritime power was given during a 2003 U.S. Naval War College conference dedicated to the topic. The then Commandant of the U.S. Coast Guard said that 21st-century maritime power speaks to a nation's needs beyond purely military ones. It embraces the needs to preserve maritime resources, ensure safe transit and passage of cargoes and peoples by water, protect its maritime borders from intrusion, uphold its maritime sovereignty, rescue the distressed at sea, and prevent misuse of the oceans. In sum, the difference between maritime power and sea power in this view is that sea power emphasizes largely the naval dimension, whereas maritime power connotes both the naval and civil elements of a nation's maritime capabilities. Chinese leaders, military and civilian officials, and security analysts have consistently viewed maritime power in this fashion, as encompassing a wide range of military and civilian capabilities. In the Chinese interpretation, however, the foundation of maritime power is a strong navy, on which other very important factors rest. These latter include a large and effective coast guard, a first-class merchant marine and fishing fleet, a globally recognized shipbuilding capability, and the ability to extract economically important maritime resources. Since 2012, it has become clear also that while China defines maritime power in its broadest sense, it also has concluded that its coercive elements are central to the protection and advancement of China's maritime rights and interests, and that they are not limited to the Navy, but include the Coast Guard, described in Appendix 1, and maritime militia, Appendix 2. It is the coercive elements of maritime power, particularly in the Navy, that constitute the primary focus of this book. What exactly are China's maritime rights and interests? Since the phrase China's maritime rights and interests first came into use in 1992, with the passage of the PRC Territorial Sea and Contiguous Zone Law, Chinese leaders have been talking about the importance of defending them. Determining precisely and in practical terms what China's maritime rights and interests means is a frustrating undertaking. It involves coming to grips with a process of circular reasoning that permits Beijing to translate Chinese perceptions, opinions, and policy preferences into Chinese laws and regulations that cannot be questioned and are to be strictly enforced. It is hard to escape the conclusion that China's maritime rights and interests are whatever China says they are. They take precedence over customary international law, including, especially, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, and are considered as having more weight than the rights and interests of neighbors. The term is used to rationalize specific maritime measures taken to enforce domestic Chinese regulations or laws passed by the Chinese National People's Congress. These laws and regulations enshrine Chinese legal rights. China's maritime interests, its goals, ambitions, and geopolitical aims have been absorbed into its laws. The so-called 9-dash line, 9DL, in the South China Sea is an example. Here, a claim to land features drawn on a nautical chart in 1946 to 1947 by the eventual losers of the Chinese Civil War, the Republic of China, ROC, was co-opted by Beijing into Chinese maritime law, as establishing its own historic rights to all resources within the 9DL. Nearly every public Chinese pronouncement about maritime power invokes China's maritime rights and interests. As we have noted, Hu Jintao officially linked the formulation of rights and interest to China's becoming a maritime power at the 18th Party Congress. President Xi Jinping has reiterated and intensified his predecessor's call for maritime power, and to that end has mobilized the state to take active countermeasures to safeguard our nation's maritime rights and interests. Essentially, China's promotion of its maritime rights and interests is an important facet of efforts to develop economically, regulate legally, and control effectively ocean areas under its claimed jurisdiction. Central elements of the rights and interests concept, accordingly, are protection and enforcement. The ability to protect China's maritime rights is considered essential to China's becoming a maritime power. In fall 2013, an official of the State Oceanic Administration, SOA, wrote, "The most important prerequisite for the building of a maritime power is to protect the nation's maritime rights and interests from being violated. If our nation's core maritime interests and the basic maritime rights and interests cannot be effectively protected, there is no way to talk about building a maritime power." That is, Chinese leaders treat the protection of maritime rights and interests as a necessary condition for becoming a maritime power. Officials, experts, media, and semi-informed citizens routinely cite it as the key component of maritime power. Simply having maritime rights and interests is not sufficient. After all, every nation that borders the sea does. For China, what is essential is being able to protect them from being violated. This is what sets China apart from many of its Asian neighbors. Beijing has the capability not only to protect, but also to advance its rights and interests coercively, if need be, while most of its neighbors do not. Why does China want to become a maritime great power? There is a sound strategic rationale behind China's desire to become a maritime great power. That will be addressed in a moment. In today's China, the most important reason is that the boss has established maritime power as a strategic objective. It is linked directly to Xi Jinping's grand strategic vision, known as the China Dream, of achieving the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation by 2049, the 100th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic. Xi has embraced maritime power as an essential element of this dream, encouraging a Weltanschauung among the party and PLA that maritime power is a necessity. Once Xi linked maritime power with the China Dream, it became a foregone conclusion that as long as he is in charge, this will remain a national objective. According to Xi, building maritime power is of great and far-reaching significance for promoting sustained and healthy economic development, safeguarding national sovereignty, security, and development interests, realizing the goal of completing the building of a well-off society, and subsequently realizing the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. At a Politburo study session in July 2013, Xi Jinping pointed out that China is at once a continental power and a maritime power, and that it possesses broad maritime strategic interests. These interests revolve around four primary strategic objectives. First, defending China from an attack from the sea by the United States. Second, making certain that China's international trade, much of it conducted by sea and on which the nation is economically dependent, is secure. Third, pursuing the global political and security interests that China's global economic interests have created. And fourth, recovering sovereignty over its claimed maritime territory, especially Taiwan. To accomplish all of these strategic objectives requires a mix of maritime capabilities, a shipbuilding industry, a large Chinese-flagged merchant marine, a capable coast guard, and most of all a large navy able to deal effectively with the threat of containment, defend China's sovereignty in the maritime domain, which includes Taiwan, and protect China's maritime trade and overseas interests. China's economic growth over the past 30 years has provided the means to accomplish these ends. China's industrial and technical capability allows it to manufacture the basic sinews of maritime power: steel, shipyards, ships of every sort, advanced shipboard weapons and combat systems, necessary to make becoming a...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?